Tonight, as the world around you softens and stills, we journey back not just in time, but into memory. Not the sharp memory of textbooks or battles, but the kind that lingers like mist in the early morning. A memory carried on the scent of firewood, the creak of old leather, the hush of a forgotten empire asleep beneath the stars. This is the story of a man the world once called Maximus, a general, a warrior, a name whispered in the shadows of history. But tonight, we won't speak of his battles, not in the way you've heard before. Tonight, we speak of his dreams, his silences, and the stillness between his steps, the parts of his story too quiet for the roar of the Colosseum. Before he became a gladiator, he was a husband, a father, a farmer, a man who knelt in soft earth and pressed seeds into the ground with fingers scarred from sword hilts. His life stretched far beyond the arena, and it began, as so many stories do, in a field, golden, endless, and whispering. Breathe in, slowly. Let the image form behind your eyelids. A field of wheat sways beneath the wind, its soft hush like the breath of the earth itself. Above, clouds drift lazily across a Roman sky, and somewhere, just out of view, a man stands alone, watching the horizon. Watching, perhaps, for something only he can see. This is where we begin. Not in fire, but in stillness. Not with blood, but with breath. The sun is low, the soil is warm, and the world, for a brief moment, is at peace. A woman's voice calls from behind a stone wall, soft and familiar. These are the things he remembers. And as you settle in now, perhaps you'll begin to remember them too. You do not need to know every detail. There's no test here, no war to prepare for, no armor to wear. Tonight, we simply listen, we drift, we walk alongside Maximus, not in armor, but in quiet. They say Rome was the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Marble temples, endless roads, law and glory carved into every street. But Rome was also made of people, of simple mornings and soft voices, of sandals worn down from long marches, of promises broken and promises kept. You are safe here. Nothing will chase you. Nothing will rise suddenly. Let the rhythm of this ancient world carry you like a boat on a still river, gently forward, gently away. If you close your eyes, you might feel the warmth of Roman sun against your skin. You might hear the murmur of Latin prayers carried on temple winds, the clatter of carts in the distance, a city waking, but not yet. First, we stay in the countryside, in the place Maximus loved most, in the land that still remembered who he truly was, before they gave him a sword, before they gave him a name to fight under. He kneels now, running a hand through tall grass. The wind catches the edge of his cloak. The earth beneath his knees is damp with dew. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. There's no one here but him, and the silence holds him like an old friend. And so you rest too, in this story, in this memory. You do not need to hold on to every word. Let them come and go like smoke, like distant thunder, like the rise and fall of your own breath. We are beginning now, but there is no rush. The arena is far away. The crowds have not yet stirred. The sands are undisturbed. This is the dream before the battle, the stillness before the storm, the breath before the blade. This is the sleep of the gladiator. The wheat moved like water. Golden stalks shifted beneath the soft pull of the morning wind, swaying in rhythm like an ancient song passed down from root to root. The sky above was pale and thin, a sleepy Roman blue, still wearing the last hints of night, and there, at the edge of the field where earth met air, stood a man, Maximus, Decimus, Meridius. His name would one day echo through amphitheaters and alleyways, carved into legend by blood and sand. But here, now, no one called his name. No one watched him. He was alone, and that was how he liked it. His boots rested deep in the dirt. His rough, calloused hands hung quietly at his sides. He had known many mornings, but few as still as this. The land stretched out before him like a great golden sea. Behind him, the stone villa still slumbered, its clay-tiled roof collecting the breath of the early sun. From its open windows came only the soft murmur of coals and the occasional creak of timber settling into the day. He had risen before the others, as he often did, not from restlessness, but from reverence. A desire to greet the land like an old friend, alone, with no sword, no orders, no armor, just silence, just home. A light breeze stirred the hem of his cloak. He didn't move. He stood in stillness, the way a soldier learns to do in cold, in rain, in command. But there was no command here, no battle. This was not the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of being. In the far distance, a rooster crowed, soft, uncertain. Maximus tilted his head slightly toward the sound, the corners of his mouth almost lifting. Life was beginning to stir around him. A horse snorted in the stable. A door creaked open. From the kitchen came the first crackle of a fire rekindling. He knelt down, the leather of his belt shifting with the motion, and reached into the wheat. His fingers brushed against the stalks, coarse and warm, already touched by sunlight. This was the land he had returned to between campaigns. This was the earth that steadied him when the world grew cruel. His hand lingered, palm open. The wheat swayed against his skin. He remembered guiding his son's small hands across these same stalks, teaching him how to walk the rows, how to listen to the wind. The memory was not sharp. It had grown soft at the edges, like cloth worn smooth by time, but it lived here still, among the roots. He closed his eyes, and in that breath of darkness, the memories came. A boy's laughter, chasing a dog through the courtyard. The scent of rosemary and ash clinging to the kitchen door. His wife's hands, always warm, always certain, folding linen with quiet strength. These were the ghosts he welcomed. Not the ghosts of battle, not the ghosts of the fallen, but the ones who had shaped him in peace. The sun rose higher now, gold spilling across the tops of the stalks. A soft warmth touched his shoulders. He remained kneeling, his head bowed, as if in prayer, though no words passed his lips. There were prayers, yes, but not to gods. His were to the wind, to the dirt, to the harvest, to the steady breath of the land that had never betrayed him. A voice called out, distant, female, familiar. He opened his eyes, but did not turn. He knew the voice well. It was woven into his bones. She would not call again. She would know where to find him. The breeze picked up, rustling the wheat around him. It sounded like 1,000 whispers, all speaking at once. Perhaps it was the sound of time itself, reminding him that this moment, this quiet, golden moment, would not last. He stood slowly. His knees protested. He ignored them. He had learned long ago that the body speaks its own language, one not always meant to be obeyed. His gaze swept the field once more, not out of necessity, but out of ritual. As if memorizing it anew, a pair of crows passed overhead. Their wings flapped once, twice, then vanished into the rising light. Somewhere behind him, a pot clanged onto a wooden table. The scent of baking bread reached him, thick, soft, alive. He turned toward the house, not quickly, with the slow confidence of a man who had nothing to fear. His footsteps pressed patterns into the dust, lines that would vanish by afternoon, but for now marked his passage. The villa was modest, but proud, built not for show, but for shelter. Its stone walls bore the heat well. Vines crept up its sides, blooming with lavender and silence. A dog barked from the courtyard and raced to meet him, tail high, eager. Maximus knelt again, one hand resting on the animal's head. "Quiet," he said softly. The dog obeyed. He passed through the archway into the courtyard. There, at a worn wooden table, sat his wife, sleeves rolled, apron tied, hands coated in flour. She didn't speak. She only smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words. And he nodded once, as if to say, yes, the field was good this morning. The boy came next, small feet on stone, a rush of energy and light. Maximus caught him mid-leap, spun him gently, set him down. The boy laughed, ran back toward the house, chasing some unseen purpose only children understood. Maximus sat down at the table, the wood creaking beneath his weight. A cup of water, a warm piece of bread. The sky was fully blue now. The wind had stilled. For a moment, the world was whole. And in this peace, deep, wordless peace, Maximus forgot the future, forgot Rome, forgot duty. There was only this, the field, the bread, the morning, and the man who belonged to it. The scent of olive oil and burning pines still lingered in the air as the General's carriage rumbled along the Via Aurelia, bound eastward toward the edges of empire. The morning sun now sat higher in the sky, its gold less tender, its light sharpened with authority. Gone were the gentle winds of the wheat fields, and in their place came the low hum of wheels on stone and the subtle metallic jingle of bridles and chain. Maximus sat upright in the saddle beside his horseman, his posture a study in discipline, but his mind still rooted in the quiet of his villa. He carried the morning with him like a second skin, as if the dust of home had followed him into the ranks. Yet duty had a way of pulling a man forward, and Rome had called again. Behind him, the long shadow of the Roman army moved like a beast in many parts. Thousands of soldiers marched in measured rhythm, their sandals striking the earth with the certainty of thunder. Spears glinted in the light, standards rippled in the breeze, and the red of their tunics spilled like blood across the landscape. But to Maximus, the most commanding sound was the silence between the steps, that collective breath between orders, the sacred calm before a battle not yet born. These men did not march for sport. They marched for something greater, something layered in duty and fear and pride. And at the head of it all, he led not with pride, but with weight. He remembered the emperor's last words to him, spoken in the privacy of a cold tent beside a smoky brazier. "You have the soul of Rome, Maximus. That is why she loves you. That is why I fear for her." It had been a strange thing to hear from a dying man. The emperor's hands had trembled when he spoke, his voice hoarse with history and regret. Even then, Maximus had not known if it was a blessing or a burden. Perhaps it was both. He did not seek power, nor did he crave the applause of the city. He served because he must, because the men trusted him, because Rome, as fractured and corrupt as it had become, still needed men who believed in something pure. The army made camp by a cold riverbank in Germania, far from the sunlight of the south. The trees here were ancient and dark, their trunks blackened with moss, their limbs gnarled like old hands reaching for the sky. Smoke from the cooking fires curled upward and mingled with the mist. Maximus walked the rows of tents in silence, exchanging nods with his centurions, offering a word here and there to the younger recruits. He did not lead from behind walls. He led from the earth. His boots tread the same mud. His cloak bore the same ash. He did not speak of glory. He spoke of survival, of doing what needed to be done so others might live another day in peace. Later that night, seated beside the fire with a worn leather map stretched across his knees, Maximus listened to the scouts' reports. The enemy was near, just days away. Barbarian tribes gathering beneath a unified banner, emboldened by whispers of Rome's waning strength. But Maximus did not fear them. He respected them. He knew what desperation could drive a man to do. He had seen it in every corner of the empire. Hunger made soldiers out of farmers. Vengeance turned sons into killers. Rome called them savages, but Maximus saw men. Angry, scared, wounded men, standing between the last wild frontiers and the creeping reach of civilization. He thought again of home, of the field, of the bread, of the small, fleeting joy in his son's laughter. He carried these memories with him like armor. Not the kind forged in fire, but the kind that wrapped itself around the soul. He did not know when he would return, or if. But, in the quiet hours before dawn, he allowed himself the softness of imagining. Just once, the boy, older now, helping with the harvest, his wife, with a streak of grey at her temple, still stronger than any commander he had known. The villa repaired, the horses grown, the olive trees bearing fruit without worry of flame or sword. He closed his eyes and let that vision root itself in the back of his mind, where fear could not find it. The battle came on the fourth morning. Thick fog hung over the forest floor, and the air smelled of wet pine and blood, before a single weapon had been drawn. The men waited behind their shields, breaths shallow, eyes hard. Maximus walked the front lines in silence, pausing to grip a shoulder, to meet a gaze, to remind each soldier that they were seen. Not as bodies, not as tools, but as men. When he spoke, it was not with shouts, but with calm command. Hold the line, wait for the sun, fight with honor, but live with more. When the clash came, it was like the sky itself fell to earth. Arrows rained from unseen treetops, metal bit into bone. War cries and the thunder of hooves tore the silence to shreds. Maximus moved like water between formations, his sword not a symbol of rage but of precision. Every motion was measured, every strike earned. Around him, the legion fought as one. Discipline against fury, order against chaos. By dusk, the battle was won. The cost, as always, was high. Maximus stood at the edge of the river, the iron taste of blood still thick in the air. His armor was dented, his face smeared with dirt and grief. He watched as the last light of day settled over the fallen, Roman and barbarian alike. No victors here, only survivors. He returned to his tent alone, removed his breastplate, washed his hands, sat in silence. Outside, the men sang, a low, mournful chant that spoke of valor and fate. Inside, Maximus closed his eyes and returned to the wheat, not in dream, but in longing. That field had never left him. Even here, surrounded by steel and smoke, it waited. He was Rome's greatest general, and yet all he wanted was to wake again in that quiet golden light, to rise before the birds, to feel the earth underfoot, to be a man, not a myth. But duty remained, and so did he. Tomorrow they would march again. The stars above the Roman encampment glimmered faintly, veiled by the breath of the forest and the smoke of fading campfires. A hush had fallen over the land, the kind that arrives only in the deepest folds of night, when the earth itself exhales and forgets to stir. Soldiers lay wrapped in their cloaks, dreaming or murmuring softly in their sleep. Even the restless horses stood quiet, their flanks rising and falling with calm, slow rhythm. But not every soul within the camp had surrendered to the silence. Deep within the heart of the command tents, shadows moved, not with the aimless grace of sleepwalkers, but with purpose, with urgency, and with a silence that reeked of ambition. Maximus sat at his writing table, oil lamp flickering beside him, casting long, wavering lines across parchment and iron. His hands were still dirty from the field, his nails stained with dust and sap, but his eyes were sharp, fixed on a letter that would never be sent. It was addressed to his wife, written in careful Latin, each stroke shaped by longing. He had tried to keep the tone light, mentioning their son's olive trees, the stubborn goat who refused to stay in the pen, the new boots he'd need when he returned. But beneath the words lingered something heavier, a shadow of uncertainty he dared not put to ink. He paused, leaned back in his seat, and let his gaze drift toward the mouth of the tent where the stars blinked like distant eyes. Outside, 2 men approached the camp on horseback, cloaks pulled high, their faces half swallowed by the darkness. One bore the crest of the Praetorian Guard, the other rode with a stiffness that betrayed his rank. They dismounted in silence, passed unnoticed through the sleeping ranks, and made their way toward the tent of the emperor. Marcus Aurelius, old and tired, awaited them without surprise. He had asked for them earlier that evening, though none had expected he would stay awake this long. He sat upright on a low cot, a blanket over his lap, scrolls scattered around him like fallen leaves. The fire near his side had burned low, and his features were drawn with shadow and thought. He looked up as the men entered, and with a gesture dismissed the guards at the door. In hushed tones they spoke of succession, of the Senate's restlessness, of Rome's need for strong hands and stronger names, and then of Maximus. The general, they said, had the love of the men, the devotion of the legions, the loyalty of the provinces. He had the people's heart, but did he have Rome's? Could the city tolerate a soldier on the throne, a man of the land instead of blood? The emperor listened, said little, and finally dismissed them with a sigh that echoed like the final breath of summer. Alone again, he sat in stillness, fingers pressed against his lips, eyes shut as if trying to see a future that remained stubbornly dark. Maximus felt the tremor in the camp before he heard it, something shifting in the rhythm of the night. A stillness too sudden, a quiet too deep. He stood, moving to the edge of the tent, senses alert. He did not know then that in another corner of the camp a future was being broken. Marcus Aurelius died before sunrise. The reports claimed illness, that his heart had given out in the night, but whispers spread faster than truth, and already the air carried the bitter scent of deception. When Maximus was summoned to the command pavilion, he sensed the change before a word was spoken. Commodus stood beside his father's bier, dressed in ceremonial black. The weight of the empire suddenly, unnaturally, his eyes, once childlike and bright, now glittered with something harder, colder. Maximus bowed his head not to the sun, but to the man who had ruled with wisdom and restraint, who had seen in Maximus not just a weapon but a protector of Rome's soul. When he looked up, Commodus smiled thinly, and the tent felt colder. What passed between them in that moment was not conversation, it was recognition. Commodus knew that Maximus had been chosen. He knew the truth, that the parchment in the emperor's quarters had not yet been delivered, and Maximus, in turn, saw what the new emperor was capable of. He had not yet worn the crown, yet already his hands were stained with ambition. Within hours, Maximus was ordered to pledge allegiance to Commodus. The ceremony was to be immediate, public, binding. But Maximus did not answer. He requested time to grieve, to prepare the army, to carry out the rites owed to a fallen father of Rome. Commodus's smile faltered. His voice dropped lower. His tone stiffened with formality. The delay was not acceptable. The oath would be made. Now, tonight. Maximus left the tent without a word. Behind him, murmurs rose like smoke, curling into corners where suspicion had already taken root. He knew what would come next. Not exile, not silence, death, quiet, clean, and immediate. That night, he packed no bags, took no horse. He simply walked into the darkness, through the tall grass at the edge of camp, away from firelight and favor, toward the unknown. But Rome does not release its tools so easily. The soldiers sent to kill him came swiftly, blades glinting in the starlight. He fought not for victory, but for time. A sword drawn not for glory, but for breath. Steel clashed, dirt kicked up, and the night swallowed their cries. When Maximus finally fell to his knees, bloodied and half-conscious, it was not the end he feared. It was forgetting the faces he loved, the fields he had left behind, the promise not yet fulfilled. They left him for dead, bound his hands, branded him as a deserter, a traitor, a man fallen from honor. By morning, he would awaken to chains. The general of Rome was no more, only the slave remained. The chains had begun to rust. They creaked softly with every shift of the cart, each jolt in the cracked Roman road sending their metal voices humming through the wooden floor beneath Maximus. He sat among others like him, dirty, silent, stripped of name and status, their backs pressed against worn timbers, their eyes dulled by the brightness of days spent in captivity. They were slaves now, bound not only by iron but by the slow, suffocating fog of humiliation. And yet, in Maximus, something deeper remained untouched. It was not hope, for hope is too fragile to survive such ruin. It was memory, memory shaped like a field, like a boy's laughter, like the voice of a woman waiting beyond the world's cruelty. Memory had roots, and Maximus was still rooted. The caravan rolled on across scorched plains and dried creek beds, moving from the cold forests of the north into the blistering heart of Africa. Rome's reach was long, and its hunger endless. Slaves fetched higher coin in the provinces, where their lives could be gambled away beneath canopies of silk and cheers. The heat grew with each passing day. The men in the carts sweated through their tunics, their skin baked and blistered beneath the unrelenting sun. One of them, a tall man with a broken nose and a poet's voice, whispered stories to himself. Fairy tales of women who walked on clouds and wine that poured from the mouths of fountains. Maximus listened without responding, but the words flickered through his mind like light on water. Stories still lived, even in cages. They arrived in Zuccobar at twilight. The town stank of spices and sweat, of roasted meat and iron. Markets buzzed with shouts and flutes. But for the newly arrived slaves, there was no welcome. They were herded into holding pens like livestock, their names replaced by numbers, their fates decided by the jingle of a merchant's purse. Proximo came at dawn, draped in faded finery, gold rings on every finger. He walked among the men with the air of a man auditioning gods. He stopped in front of Maximus, tilted his head, looked him up and down like a sculptor assessing marble. Then, without a word, he nodded to the guards and moved on. Maximus had been chosen. The training grounds were carved into the red rock beyond the city, a circular pit surrounded by sand-colored walls and shouting overseers. Here, a man learned quickly that pain was a teacher and blood a language. Maximus did not speak often, but he listened. He studied. He watched the way the older fighters moved, how they used momentum, how they breathed through the agony. His body remembered the sword, though it had not held one since the forest. The wooden gladius they placed in his hands felt wrong, but he adjusted. He always did. He was no longer a general, but he could still be a weapon. Days became weeks. The bruises faded slower than the cuts. Some men died in the training itself, not from blades, but from despair. Others tried to fight their fate and were beaten for the effort. Maximus did neither. He waited, he watched, and when they finally called him into the arena, he did not hesitate. The crowd was smaller than the great Colosseums of Rome, but no less ravenous. They roared for blood, for spectacle, for distraction from their own weary lives. Proximo stood in the shadows, arms crossed, watching his investment. Maximus stepped onto the sand, eyes steady, heart silent. His opponent was larger, louder, armored in rusted chainmail and fury. The man swung first, wide and careless. Maximus ducked, pivoted, struck the back of the knee. Another blow came, wild and graceless. Maximus caught it on his shield, stepped inward, drove his wooden blade against the man's ribs. The crowd screamed. Dust rose. The fight ended quickly. It was not triumph that Maximus felt, but stillness, as though a part of him had returned. Not the part that wore command, but the part that survived. He fought again the next day, and again, and again, each time more deliberate, each time more feared. His fellow slaves began to look at him differently, not as one of them, but as something older, something shaped by war and grief. The poet with the broken nose began calling him Spaniard, and the name stuck. Proximo smiled more, wagered more. The crowds chanted louder. They did not know his story. They did not know he once led armies, that emperors once listened when he spoke. They only knew the sand, and the sword, and the silent man who did not fall. One night, after a particularly brutal match, Maximus sat alone beneath the stars, his arms streaked with blood not his own. He looked up at the sky, at the unfamiliar constellations of this foreign land, and he whispered a name, his son's, then his wife's. The names were all he had left, that was his. He did not weep, he had no tears left to offer, but he did promise, a quiet vow carried only by the wind. They would be avenged. Rome would remember. In time, Proximo took him aside, spoke of opportunity, of travel, of Rome. The games in the capital were approaching. Commodus had reopened the Colosseum to celebrate his rule. Gladiators from across the empire would fight there, and Proximo had a spot. For Spaniard, Maximus said nothing, but deep within him something stirred, not rage, not vengeance, something colder, something older. A man had died in the forest, but something else had risen in the arena, and now that something would return to Rome. The road to Rome was not paved with honor, but with memory. Long and winding, it twisted through the bones of forgotten battlefields, past crumbling aqueducts and hills dotted with withered olive trees, all watched over by statues whose eyes had long since turned to stone. The caravan moved steadily, Proximo's retinue of fighters drawing the attention of villagers and tax collectors alike. But none stirred as much curiosity as the silent one in the back. They called him Spaniard, but he responded to no name, spoke to no man, and kept his eyes forward as if he saw something just ahead that no one else could. Rome loomed like a dream on the horizon, rising slowly from the mist as the days passed. Its domes and pillars breaking free from the countryside like a city made from marble and myth. Maximus had not seen it in years. Not since the triumphal marches, the feasts beneath chandeliers, the grand halls echoing with the footfalls of ambition. Now he returned, not through gates of gold, but through the servants' road, in the shadow of Proximo's caravan, dressed in the leathers of a slave and the silence of a man reborn. Rome had changed, and yet, somehow, it had not changed at all. The streets still bustled with merchants and beggars. The temples still bled incense into the sky. Children still played with wooden swords in the alleyways, shouting names of champions they would never know. And everywhere, banners, blood red, silk draped from columns and rooftops, bearing the crest of Commodus, emperor and son of legacy. His image was painted across stone and plaster, grinning down at the people as though he had built the empire himself. Maximus did not look up. Proximo led them through the thick of the city, weaving past taverns and courtyards until they reached the Ludius Magnus, one of the training schools where gladiators slept, bled, and waited to die. It was vast and cold, with a courtyard of sand and shadow. The new arrivals were greeted not with welcome, but with whips and orders. The local lanista, a man named Falco, took stock of each fighter with the same detached efficiency a butcher gives his meat. Maximus offered no resistance, but his silence, as always, unsettled them. There was something in his eyes they couldn't read, something that didn't belong in a slave. He trained with the others, kept to himself, ate little, and slept less. And still, he won every sparring match. Not with rage or spectacle, but with calm, precise violence. Each movement controlled, each blow measured. It wasn't entertainment, it was inevitability. Days passed in preparation. Rome stirred with excitement. The Colosseum had not hosted games of this scale in years, and Commodus had promised the people a spectacle unlike any seen before. Foreign beasts were brought in from distant jungles, chariots were assembled, prisoners were offered last rites. Senators protested quietly. The crowd didn't care. Rome was hungry, and Commodus had every intention of feeding it. Maximus watched the preparations from a corner of the courtyard, his eyes distant. He heard the cheers rising from the amphitheater even in rehearsal. The drums, the horns, the rumble of tens of thousands yearning to forget their own lives by watching others lose theirs. He had heard those roars before, from the floor of the battlefield. There, they had meant survival. Here, they meant spectacle. The night before the first games, Proximo found him alone, seated in the shadows beneath a broken statue of Mars. The old man lit a pipe, coughed, and sat beside him without speaking for a long while. Then, quietly, he said, "Some men die for coin, some for fame, but you fight like a man trying to remember who he was." Maximus didn't reply. There was nothing to say, but in the silence, something passed between them. Not friendship, not alliance, but understanding. Proximo saw now that the man he had bought in the dust of Zuckerbar was not just a fighter. He was something Rome hadn't seen in a long time. A man with purpose. The kind of purpose that made emperors nervous. When morning came, the streets of Rome pulsed with excitement. The Colosseum loomed above them like a beast carved from bone. its arches stretching wide into the sky, its belly filled with hunger. Maximus stood in the holding cells beneath the arena, his armor strapped tight, his helmet heavy in his hands. Around him, men prayed, others trembled, some kissed coins for luck. He did none of these things. He simply waited, listening to the drums overhead as they began to beat faster, louder, like the sound of a coming storm. When the gates opened, light poured in, blinding, golden, holy, and Maximus walked forward into the light, not as a man seeking glory, but as a shadow returning home. The roar of the crowd hit him like a wave, tens of thousands of voices, screaming in unison, demanding blood. The sand beneath his feet was dry and pale, speckled with old stains. The other fighters fanned out around him, glancing nervously toward the Emperor's box. Maximus looked only at the walls, at the height of them, at the weight of stone and history pressing in on all sides. And then he looked up, finally, and saw him, Commodus, seated in robes of ivory, flanked by guards and flatterers, smiling as if he had never tasted betrayal. Their eyes met for only a second. Commodus did not recognize him, not yet, but he would. Maximus lowered his helmet over his face, the iron cool against his brow, and gripped the hilt of his gladius. He did not breathe deeply. He did not pray. He simply waited. And when the signal came, and the chaos began, Maximus moved not with rage, but with purpose. Not as a slave, not as a soldier, but as the man Rome had forgotten. And the Colosseum, for a moment, fell still. The sunlight above the Colosseum had begun to tilt, casting long golden shadows across the sand, turning the arena into a great sun-drenched bowl of tension. Dust hung in the air like smoke, stirred by the chaos of combat, but now suspended in the heavy quiet that followed. Maximus stood at the center of the arena, blood streaking his arm, his chest rising and falling in calm, deliberate breaths. Around him, the bodies of the fallen lay still, their stories finished, their fates sealed by the whim of spectacle. The roar of the crowd, once deafening, had begun to hush, replaced by murmurs, a shifting of voices like the movement of water when something unexpected falls into its depths. They had watched a fight, but what they had witnessed was something else, something different. The man in the mask had fought not like a brawler, not like a showman, but like a commander. From the imperial box, Commodus leaned forward, one hand resting lightly on the carved lion's head at the edge of his throne. His expression, once smug, now flickered with something more uncertain. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition that hadn't yet reached his tongue. He turned to Lucilla, seated just behind him, her face hidden beneath a veil of decorum. "Who is he?" he asked quietly, the words half swallowed by the cheers. She didn't answer, couldn't, because she already knew. She had known from the moment he stepped into the arena, from the way he moved, from the silence that followed his footsteps like a shadow. Below, the Praetorian announcer stepped forward, voice booming across the stadium. "The victor of the games, Gladiator, reveal yourself to Rome." Maximus stood still, Gladius still at his side, helmet unmoved. A hush settled over the Colosseum, as though all of Rome were holding its breath. And then, slowly, Maximus removed the helmet, lifting it from his head and letting the late afternoon light fall upon his face. His hair was longer now, beard thickened by months in the dust, eyes sunken and darker than before, but unmistakable. The silence deepened into stillness. 1,000 eyes widened, 1,000 voices caught in their throats. The general had returned. Commodus stood slowly, his lips parting but no words forming. His fingers twitched at his side. His face, once trained to perform before crowds, momentarily betrayed him. Shock flickered across it like lightning across an open field. "Maximus," he said, though no one heard it but Lucilla. She had not moved, not even blinked. Below, Maximus stared up at them both. His voice, when it came, was steady and low. "My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, general of the Felix legions." Recognition, or the kind of sound made not for blood, but for legend. Commodus waved his hand sharply, signaling for the guards, the fanfare, anything to reclaim control of the moment. But the damage was done, the mask had fallen, and beneath it was not a slave, but a man who had once been the heart of Rome. In the days that followed, the city buzzed like a disturbed hive. Rumors spread through every corner of the empire's great body. The general lives, the general fights, the general fights, the general has returned. The Senate whispered behind closed doors. Merchants told tales to their customers. Children reenacted the moment in alleyways and courtyards. But Commodus said nothing publicly. He attended the games with more frequency, his smile brittle, his applause sharp and hollow. He had won the throne through blood and fear. But fear, when cracked, lets memory through, and the people remembered Maximus. Maximus was kept under tighter guard now, but he didn't resist. He ate little, spoke less. His presence alone stirred the dust of old Rome, and he knew it. He did not seek to reclaim anything, only to complete what was unfinished. At night, in the cool silence of the training quarters, Lucilla came to him, veiled, cloaked, her voice tight with memory. They spoke softly, as though afraid their words might awaken ghosts. She told him of her son, of the corruption that had spread beneath Commodus's reign, of the city's decay masked by glittering parades and empty promises. He offered advice when he could, warnings when needed. But Maximus simply nodded. He had faced death. He had lost everything. What remained of him now was focused, honed like the edge of the gladius he kept by his side. Commodus, for all his power, for all his cruelty, had never truly held the heart of Rome. Maximus had, still did, and in the Colosseum, beneath the weight of 100,000 eyes, that truth became harder to ignore. But power does not yield quietly. It claws, it plots. And deep within the marble halls of the palace, Commodus began to plan, not for war, but for theatre. He would beat the general not on the field, but on the stage. He would destroy him not as a man, but as a myth, strip him bare before the people, prove that even legends bleed. Maximus waited. He trained, he listened, and he remembered. The mask was gone, but the mission remained. He was no longer hiding. He was becoming inevitable. Morning in Rome arrived not with peace, but with pageantry. The sun rose slowly over the tiled rooftops and curled pillars, its warm light casting long shadows through the marble arches of the Colosseum. Distant bells rang softly from temples, echoing across the hills as incense curled through alleyways and the scent of bread drifted from bakeries, opening their doors to the waking city. But within the depths of the amphitheater, where the sun's golden fingers barely reached, something darker was stirring, a performance rehearsed not in joy but in cruelty. Commodus had announced a new series of spectacles to the people, proclaiming a celebration of Rome's triumphs. What he truly wanted was distraction, a display, a lesson for those who still remembered the name Maximus. Beneath the arena, in the damp stone corridors and iron-barred cages, the gladiators were awakened before dawn. Maximus sat alone near the corner of his cell, back pressed to the cold wall, legs folded, head lowered as if in prayer, though no words left his lips. His sword rested across his lap, not in threat, but in calm readiness. Above, the crowd had already begun to gather, their voices rising like the tide, laughter and anticipation churning together. They had come not only for blood, but for the strange thrill of proximity to death. It comforted them, in some forgotten part of their Roman souls, to believe they were still part of something grand, something eternal, that the empire was still mighty, even if only in the bodies it crushed for sport. Maximus was summoned mid-morning. Guards approached with mechanical precision, their faces unreadable, their steps practiced. He rose wordlessly and followed them, passing torchlit corridors where other fighters waited in silence, offering him glances laced with both reverence and sorrow. He had become something more than legend among them, a symbol, and symbols were dangerous in Rome. Commodus knew this. That was why today's fight was not a test of skill, but a theatre of humiliation. The arena had been transformed. Gone were the familiar sand and steel. In their place, a stage had been built to mimic the rolling hills of Germania. False trees, painted stones, and theatrical mist drifting from brass urns. Children played the part of peasants in robes and wreaths, scattering flowers along a mock road, and in the center, standing alone in gilded armor, was Commodus himself. He wore a lion skin draped across his shoulders and held a spear tipped in gold. At his side, a lamb was tethered to a stake, pure, white, fragile. The symbolism was not subtle. Maximus entered to thunderous applause, but he did not raise his head. He walked with slow, measured steps, taking in the absurdity of the scene before him. The false hills, the emperor in costume, the lamb bleating softly against its rope. It was not a contest, it was a message. Commodus raised his arms dramatically and addressed the crowd with practiced flourish. Today, he declared, we tame beasts. We restore order to the wild. We show Rome that even the fiercest lion bows before its master. The crowd cheered, uncertain whether it was truth or performance. It hardly mattered. The emperor had spoken. Commodus then gestured for the fight to begin, though Maximus was unarmed. His sword had been withheld. The only weapon present was the golden spear in the emperor's hand. Silence swept across the arena like wind across a field. Maximus did not flinch. He stood, eyes fixed on Commodus, the sunlight cutting down between them like judgment itself. Commodus advanced slowly, circling, his voice dripping with false warmth, as he asked how it felt to stand here again, in the place of his humiliation, to see what Rome had become, not his, but Commodus's. Maximus said nothing. He watched the emperor, not with hatred, but with quiet understanding. He saw the fear behind the theatre, the insecurity beneath the crown. Commodus moved closer, lifting the spear as if to strike. But even then, Maximus did not move. The lamb bleated again, as if echoing the tension in the silence. The emperor hesitated. His grip shifted. The crowd leaned in, sensing the unraveling of the script. Then, from behind, a voice cried out. A senator, perhaps, or a guard, startled by a flash of recognition. It broke the moment. Commodus faltered, and in that pause, Maximus stepped forward, not to strike, not to resist, but to kneel, a movement so unexpected it stole the breath from the arena. He bowed his head. Commodus stood above him, spear still raised, now trembling slightly. He had won, hadn't he? Yet something about the moment felt hollow, like a man victorious in his dream, but waking to find it meant nothing. He did not strike. He could not, and so he turned, waving off the crowd, declaring mercy with a flourish and a smirk. The crowd roared, not in joy, but in confusion. Maximus was led away, still silent, still undefeated. In the corridors below, the guards eyed him with new uncertainty. For what power was more terrifying than strength, restraint? And Maximus had just shown Rome that he could possess both. Later that night, as torches flickered low and the city quieted into its nocturnal hush, Commodus paced the marbled halls of his palace alone. He stared into the polished bronze of a mirror, searching for certainty in his own reflection, but finding none. Maximus haunted him, not as a ghost, but as a presence. A future not yet destroyed, a truth not yet buried. Maximus lay on his cot in the darkness, the lamb's cry still echoing faintly in his mind, not as mockery, but as omen. Rome was a stage now, and every performance edged closer to an end. He would not need to strike first. He only needed to wait for the emperor to reveal himself. And then, as always, he would endure. Morning in Rome arrived not with peace, but with pageantry. The sun rose slowly over the tiled rooftops and curled pillars, its warm light casting long shadows through the marble arches of the Colosseum. Distant bells rang softly from temples, echoing across the hills. As incense curled through alleyways and the scent of bread drifted from bakeries opening their doors to the waking city, but within the depths of the amphitheatre, where the sun's golden fingers barely reached, something darker was stirring, a performance rehearsed, not in joy, but in cruelty. Commodus had announced a new series of spectacles to the people, proclaiming a celebration of Rome's triumphs. What he truly wanted was distraction, a display, a lesson for those who still remembered the name Maximus. Beneath the arena, in the damp stone corridors and iron-barred cages, the gladiators were awakened before dawn. Maximus sat alone near the corner of his cell, back pressed to the cold wall, legs folded, head lowered as if in prayer, though no words left his lips. His sword rested across his lap, not in threat, but in calm readiness. Above, the crowd had already begun to gather, their voices rising like the tide, laughter and anticipation churning together. They had come not only for blood, but for the strange thrill of proximity to death. It comforted them, in some forgotten part of their Roman souls, to believe they were still part of something grand, something eternal, that the empire was still mighty, even if only in the bodies it crushed for sport. Maximus was summoned mid-morning. Guards approached with mechanical precision, their faces unreadable, their steps practiced. He rose wordlessly and followed them, passing torchlit corridors where other fighters waited in silence, offering him glances laced with both reverence and sorrow. He had become something more than legend among them, a symbol, and symbols were dangerous in Rome. Commodus knew this, That was why today's fight was not a test of skill, but a theater of humiliation. The arena had been transformed. Gone were the familiar sand and steel. In their place, a stage had been built to mimic the rolling hills of Germania. False trees, painted stones, and theatrical mist drifting from brass urns. Children played the part of peasants in robes and wreaths, scattering flowers along a mock road. And in the center, standing alone in gilded armor, was Commodus himself. He wore a lion skin draped across his shoulders and held a spear tipped in gold. At his side, a lamb was tethered to a stake, pure, white, fragile. The symbolism was not subtle. Maximus entered to thunderous applause, but he did not raise his head. He walked with slow, measured steps, taking in the absurdity of the scene before him. The false hills, the emperor in costume, the lamb bleating softly against its rope. It was not a contest, it was a message. Commodus raised his arms dramatically and addressed the crowd with practiced flourish. Today, he declared, we tame beasts. We restore order to the wild. We show Rome that even the fiercest lion bows before its master. The crowd cheered, uncertain whether it was truth or performance. It hardly mattered. The emperor had spoken. Commodus then gestured for the fight to begin. Though Maximus was unarmed, his sword had been withheld. The only weapon present was the golden spear in the emperor's hand. Silence swept across the arena like wind across a field. Maximus did not flinch. He stood, eyes fixed on Commodus, the sunlight cutting down between them like judgment itself. Rome at night was a different city altogether. By day, it roared with the voices of merchants and crowds, armor clinking against cobblestones, the laughter of nobles drifting from balconies. But when the sun dipped below the western hills and the last hues of orange faded into dusk, a quieter Rome emerged. Torches burned low along the Via Sacra, their flames flickering against time-worn stone. The air cooled and thickened, carrying with it the scent of olive smoke, damp marble, and lingering incense from evening prayers. And in the shadows, men whispered. Secrets flourished in the darkness like ivy on forgotten ruins. For all its grandeur, Rome had always been a city of layers. Temples above, catacombs below, declarations in the Senate, betrayals in the alleys. And as Maximus lay awake beneath the Colosseum, staring at the cracked ceiling above him, he knew he was not the only one watching, not the only one waiting. Word of his survival had stirred something beneath the surface of the city. Senators, long silenced by fear, began to exchange glances again in public, their words still cautious but laced with a new urgency. Those loyal to Marcus Aurelius remembered. They remembered a Rome before Commodus, before the pageantry and cruelty, when discipline still held sway over vanity, and when generals were servants of the Republic rather than its showpieces. And now a general had returned, not to march with legions, but to remind the people of what had been lost. Maximus had not made speeches. He had not rallied support, but his silence echoed louder than Commodus's parades. In the darkened halls of the Senate, conversations resumed behind drawn curtains. Lucilla, ever discreet, moved between factions with the grace of someone who had played this game far longer than most realized. She met with old allies under the pretense of temple visits, cloaking her every movement in ritual and decorum. But her eyes burned with calculation. She had seen what Commodus had become. She had feared what Rome might decay into under his hand. And she had always known that, should the time come, there was only one man who could balance the scales. Maximus was not merely a memory. He was the answer to a question the Empire was too afraid to ask. What happens when the wrong man rules? In the depths of the ludus, Maximus remained patient. Proximo had begun to pace more in recent days, smoking constantly, muttering half-thoughts, and weighing opportunities. He was no philosopher, but he understood leverage, and he could feel the winds shifting. "You're not just a fighter anymore," he whispered to Maximus one evening. "You're a symbol. Symbols, my friend, are hard to kill, but they make powerful enemies." Maximus did not respond. He understood all too well. Every glance from a guard lingered longer now. Every meal delivered with unusual care. It was not fear he felt, nor anticipation, it was clarity. Rome was holding its breath, and the moment to exhale was drawing near. As the city prepared for yet another round of grand games, each one more extravagant than the last, Commodus withdrew further into isolation. He surrounded himself with flatterers and mystics, desperate for omens, desperate for control, but dreams troubled his sleep. Visions of wheat fields, of a man walking through fog with blood on his hands and fire behind his eyes. The emperor's mask of confidence grew thinner with each passing day. He had turned Rome into a theater, but now the actors whispered backstage. Even his sister watched him differently now. There was no trust left, only pretense. One night, as moonlight slipped across the rooftops and the Tiber flowed silently past the edges of the city, Lucilla visited Maximus again. She came without guards, without ceremony. They spoke in hushed tones, their words soft as breath. She told him of the senators gathering quietly, of a plan, not for a coup, but for a transition, a chance to restore the empire without war, without blood. She asked him, not for violence, but for presence, to stand, to be seen, to be the anchor that reminded Rome what it once was. Maximus listened. His eyes, once so hardened, now held a kind of distant grief. "I have no interest in power," he said. "I want only peace, for my wife, for my son, for the Rome they believed in." She reached for his hand. They said nothing more. Meanwhile, in the palace, Commodus's paranoia deepened. He ordered his food tasted 3 times, doubled his personal guard, executed a servant for whispering too softly. He knew Maximus was still alive, still fighting, still walking through the dreams of senators and slaves alike. He understood now what fear really meant, not of death, but of being forgotten, and in that fear he planned something final. One last game, one last spectacle, not for the people, for himself. In the labyrinth beneath the Colosseum, torches were lit late into the night. Animal cages were rearranged. Slaves hurried under whip and whisper. Something was coming, a final act. Rome did not sleep. It held its breath in the dark, wrapped in velvet and rust, waiting to see whether the lion would fall or rise once more. And Maximus, quiet in his cell, simply closed his eyes, not to dream, but to prepare. The dawn rose quietly over Rome, casting a soft golden light across the arches and domes, but the city beneath it was already awake, not with noise, but with tension. A strange hush settled over the markets, the temples, and the taverns. Bread was still baked, incense still burned, and soldiers still patrolled the cobbled streets. Yet something hung in the air that could not be named. The people could feel it. It whispered through their routines, settled behind their eyes, lingered in the stillness between footsteps. They all knew today would not be like the others. Something final was coming, something Rome had not seen in generations. And as the shadows shortened and the bells chimed their morning songs, The city began its slow movement toward the Colosseum, as though being drawn there not by choice, but by gravity. The arena loomed in the pale light, more temple than theatre, more grave than monument. It had seen 1,000 fights, 10,000 deaths, but it had never seen this. Today, there would be no exotic beasts, no theatrical recreations of ancient battles, no staged tragedies meant to mimic heroism. Today, there would be one fight, 2 men, and the emperor himself would step into the ring. Rumors had spiraled for days, spoken in low voices behind shuttered windows. Commodus would fight, not with soldiers, not with armies, but with Maximus, the fallen general, the risen gladiator, the memory Rome could not bury. Beneath the arena, Maximus was prepared in silence. His armor was simple, darkened steel fitted over worn linen, its edges dulled not from disuse but from time. His gladius was handed to him by a boy no older than 10, whose hands trembled with awe more than fear. Maximus looked into the boy's eyes, nodded once, and turned away. He had no illusions. This was not a duel. It was a ritual. Commodus had arranged every part of it. The lighting, the armor, the audience. But the one thing he could not arrange was the heart of the man he faced. And in that, Maximus held his only advantage. Above, the stands filled quickly. Senators sat with stiff backs. Citizens with bated breath. Even the poorest had found their way into the marble arches, eager not just to witness bloodshed, but to be present for a moment that might become legend. Lucilla sat in a shadowed corner, her eyes fixed on the gate. She had dressed not in royal silks, but in deep mourning black. She was not there as a sister to the emperor. She was there as a witness to what should have never come to pass. Commodus emerged first, draped in armor too ornate to be functional, its gold edges glinting in the morning sun. He carried a spear etched with the symbols of Jupiter, a gladius at his hip, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. The crowd applauded because they were meant to, but beneath the surface of their cheers was a different kind of sound, one that trembled like the hush before a storm. When Maximus stepped into the light, the sound changed. It did not roar, it resonated. A different kind of energy moved through the arena. Not celebration, recognition. The 2 men stood at opposite ends of the sand, one dressed in pageantry, the other in purpose. Commodus lifted his spear with a flourish, called out to the crowd, promised glory, and invoked the gods. Maximus said nothing. He adjusted the grip on his gladius, took one step forward, and waited. The drums began, soft at first, then louder, pounding like the heartbeat of the empire itself. And with a single nod from the emperor, the match began. Commodus lunged first. His strikes were fast but showy, designed for spectacle. Maximus deflected them easily, his movements measured and economical. He had not come to dance. He had come to end something. The crowd watched in growing silence as the pageantry unraveled. The emperor, so confident in his own story, began to falter. Sweat gleamed on his brow. His breaths grew ragged. Maximus remained steady, his eyes never leaving his opponent, not out of hatred, but out of memory. He was not fighting Commodus, the emperor. He was facing the boy who had betrayed a father, stolen a throne, and plunged Rome into its long night. The duel stretched on, not long in time, but infinite in weight. Each clash of steel felt like a reckoning. And then, with one sharp movement, the balance shifted. Commodus stumbled. Maximus struck, not to kill, but to disarm. The golden spear clattered to the ground. The emperor fell back, eyes wide, the mask stripped away completely. He was not a god, not a hero, just a frightened man, clutching at robes that no longer granted power. The arena held its breath. Maximus raised his sword. The sunlight framed him in a halo of dust and silence. But he did not strike. Instead, he lowered the weapon, turned away, and dropped the gladius into the sand. A murmur passed through the crowd. It grew into a sound Rome had not heard in a lifetime. Not cheers, applause, true applause, not for blood, for restraint, for memory, for mercy. Humiliated and desperate, lunged for a hidden dagger at his waist, but it was too late. The guards moved. Lucilla stood, and the crowd turned against its emperor. The truth had been seen, not in words, but in choice. Maximus did not kill him. Rome did. As guards pulled Commodus away, flailing and shouting, Maximus remained still. His eyes closed for a moment as the wind moved across the arena, stirring the sand around his feet. The sun warmed his skin. He breathed deeply, for the first time in years. Not as a soldier, not as a slave, but as a man finally free. The sand had quieted. The roar of the crowd that once echoed through marble and sky had faded into a distant memory. The Colosseum stood as it always had, vast and eternal, yet now touched by something new. Not glory, not blood, but stillness. As the sun climbed its way toward noon, warm light spilled across the worn arena floor, painting soft golden hues across every crack and scar left by centuries of violence. At the center of it all, Maximus remained, unmoving, eyes half closed, as if listening to something far away. His breathing was slow, his shoulders relaxed. The weight he had carried through war, through betrayal, through the chains of captivity, had finally slipped from him, and in its place was only quiet. He had not spoken after the final clash. There were no grand speeches, no words to mark the end of an empire's myth. He had simply turned from the fallen emperor and walked toward the rising sun. Guards parted for him without command. Lucilla, watching from the upper tier, pressed a hand to her heart, her lips trembling not with fear, but with something like reverence. Rome had not witnessed a victory. It had witnessed a return, not of power, but of memory, of honor, of the man the empire once was, and perhaps, in some quiet way, could be again. That evening, the Senate met behind closed doors. The chaos that might have followed such a moment, rebellion, power struggles, blood in the streets, never came. For Maximus had asked for nothing. He had claimed no throne, seized no command. Instead, he vanished from the halls of the palace and was seen walking alone through the forum, the marble statues casting long shadows across his path. Some claimed he left Rome that same night, taking only what he had brought with him, his sword, his silence, and a name now carved in more than stone. Others believed he stayed a while, watching from afar as the city found its balance again, quietly ensuring the restoration of what had been lost. But none could say for certain. The truth of legends is never as clear as the memory they leave behind. In the countryside, beyond the city, where cypress trees swayed in the wind and the wheat fields rolled like oceans of gold, the land waited. It had always waited. And in the gentle rustle of the grass, in the warmth of the late summer sun, something familiar stirred. A man walked through the field, his fingertips brushing the tops of the stalks. He moved slowly, without urgency, each step more memory than motion. The same dream he had returned to again and again, through pain, through darkness. Now clearer than ever, it was not a vision anymore. It was a homecoming. The sky stretched wide above him, soft and endless, painted in the hues of peace. A house stood at the edge of the horizon, its stone walls blanketed in ivy, smoke curling gently from the chimney. The door creaked open, and there, framed in sunlight, stood a woman. Her eyes were kind, her smile unchanged by time. A child ran across the grass toward the man, arms outstretched, laughter ringing like chimes in the wind. Maximus knelt, arms wide, his heart lifting with every step. They embraced not as dreams, but as truth, as reunion, as rest. No more swords, no more sand, no more sand, no more masks. Only the field, only the breeze, only the peace of all that had been endured. And far away, in the great city of Rome, the Colosseum remained, a monument not to the emperor, but to the man who chose mercy over vengeance, silence over spectacle, and memory over legacy. Maximus Decimus Meridius had become more than a general, more than a gladiator, more than even a myth. He had become the dream of Rome, quiet, steady, and eternal. So now, dear listener, let yourself drift as he once did. Let the arena fade. Let the wind carry you. There is no battle left to fight, no throne left to claim. Just a path of wheat under your feet, and the soft hum of peace waiting on the other side. You have walked far. You have endured much, and now you may rest. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. There is nothing more to see tonight. The sand has settled, the swords have fallen silent, and the Colosseum is still beneath the stars. Maximus walks no more, but his story lingers, soft as a whisper, cradled in the quiet corners of your mind. Let it stay with you, gently. Let it become a dream of honor, of love, of strength, softened by peace. You are safe now, here, in this stillness. There are no battles to fight, no voices to answer, no world to carry, only breath, only warmth, only the soft hum of time moving gently through the past. Let your body rest, let your thoughts fade. You've wandered through ancient lands, seen the rise and fall of empires, and now it's your time to sleep. If this journey brought you comfort, know that there are many more stories waiting, tales of forgotten worlds, quiet revolutions, and the slow heartbeat of history. Subscribe to The Historian Sleeps and join us again when the stars return. Until then, rest deeply, dream well, and let the past hold you gently through the night. The city exhaled in stages, as if reluctant to release the roar it had swallowed. Torches guttered along the avenues, and the last of the revelers drifted like scattered leaves, their sandals whispering over stone. Vendors counted coins under their breath and closed their shutters with the soft, decisive thud of wood against wood. A wind slid down from the Palatine and moved the awnings with a sound like distant surf. And for a moment the amphitheatre seemed to float above its foundations, a dark crown on a sleeping head. The sand in the arena still held footprints that would survive until morning, lines and swirls where bodies had turned and hesitated. The geometry of pride and fear pressed into grains that remembered more faithfully than men. In narrow lanes, cats threaded between baskets. A boy carried a bundle of laurel cuttings to a door and hesitated, as if listening for an answer from inside the wood. Two old men argued without speaking, faces tilted, hands describing the shape of a tale they would tell differently tomorrow. A woman emptied a bowl of water down a stair and watched it snake along a crack toward a gutter that led to a darkness she did not question. Above it all, The night held the city like a physician's cool palm against a fevered brow. Measuring, appraising, saying nothing. Across the river, a temple drumbeat faded toward silence, and then returned in a single patient thud, as if the heart of Rome had remembered something it had meant to say. Lamps dimmed one by one along the forum, leaving statues to reclaim their stillness. Marble eyes turned opaque. Bronze hands forgot their gestures. In porticos, where deals had been struck by daylight, only the smell of smoke and oil remained, thin as memory and twice as persistent. Word of the day's mercy traveled in spirals, not lines. It moved through kitchens before senatorial chambers, through stables before counting rooms. It gathered heat in the mouths of the poor, who knew how to warm a story by holding it near flesh. The emperor had spared the kneeling man, they said, and the crowd had been denied the clean edge of an ending. Some called it magnanimity. Some called it theatre. Most called it a sign, though they could not agree of what. The amphitheater's corridors cooled. Blood on a discarded cloth turned rust brown, and a broom leaned against the wall as if resting from a long pilgrimage. In the lowest cells, the air was damp enough to taste. Iron bars knew the shape of knuckles and the weight of foreheads, and kept both confidences and fingerprints. Above ground, a single shutter clacked and fell still. Rome slept, but not completely. One eye stayed open. One ear refused to close. He walked the mirrored length of his private hall as if pacing the inside of a thought. The bronze gave back a face he recognized and a posture he did not. Shoulders squared but slightly too high, like a man holding armor he had not grown into. The spear leaned against a column, a disciplined line among curves, and its tip showed a smear so thin it might have been a trick of lamplight. He drew a cloth across it anyway, because ritual steadied the hand when reason could not. Fragments returned without asking permission, a knee bending to the sand, a head bowing as if toward an altar, the sudden absence of breath from tens of thousands, an inhalation that never found the other side. He replayed his flourish, the dismissal of death, the gracious wave, and found no satisfaction in the memory. Mercy, offered to prove dominion, had looked like a bargain. Struck with his own reflection, he lifted the spear and practiced the gesture again, once, twice, seeking the missing note. Somewhere a hinge cried softly. He stopped and listened, as if a corridor could answer. He tried on victory in the mind and discovered a lining of ash. He tried on anger and found it too loud for the hour. What remained was a thinner thing, a cold thread he could not name without making it harder to pull free. In the silence, he thought of the lamb, of the ropes, soft tension, of innocence used as ornaments, and felt the stagehand's shadow cross his feet. The show had run to time. The actors had moved their marks, yet the audience had left carrying something he had not meant to give. A servant scratched at the far door and did not enter. The emperor turned the cloth in his fingers until it made a tight sleeping snail and set it beside a lamp. He imagined the city below his balcony, roofs like scales on a single great creature, its breath rising in threads of smoke. He imagined the kneeling man in a room with no mirrors, refusing to rehearse what needed no practice. The thought struck him in the ribs like cold air. He stepped away from the glass and chose darkness over his own face. A cough stitched itself into the wool of the night. Men who had perfected the craft of dying sat with their backs to stone and argued with memories they did not share aloud. but as men who could choose to refuse the obvious shape of a moment. One polished the edge of a blade that would never be allowed above ground again and saw, in the thin reflected line, a road out of the body. A third slept with his mouth open, gathering the cold into his lungs and letting it go, a metronome for those who could not. They spoke in low tones when they spoke at all. They spoke of the emperor's hand and how it had hovered, of the crowd's confusion, of a rope tied to an animal that did not know symbolism and so understood it better. They called Maximus by names he would not have accepted for himself, and by a few he would. Some believed the gesture had bought them a season. Others believed it had spent one. All of them felt the wall lean closer by a finger's width, as if listening. Across the corridor, a guard shifted the leather on his shoulder and found that it no longer sat where it always had, as if his body had changed shape without consulting him. He told himself the weight was the same, that the night was the same, that tomorrow's sun would find the same iron chewing the same light. He did not quite convince himself. In a corner cell where the mortar had failed in a line of thumbprints, Maximus lay as before, eyes open to a darkness that had learned his outline. Sleep came and went like a tide without the moon. He counted his breaths until the numbers loosened, not to reach the shore, but to prove one existed. The sound of the lamb rose again in the mind, not as a cry this time, but as a thread sewn through cloth, drawing edges together. He kept still and let the thought pass through him, until it no longer needed his body to exist. He was led along a corridor that knew the geography of endings. Footfalls recorded themselves in the damp and blurred again. Torches carried their own small weather, a wavering wind that made the light seem tired and stubborn. The guards did not speak. Their discipline felt less like obedience than like superstition. The old sailor's belief that naming a thing could summon the wrong sea. Steps rose and levelled and rose again. At a turn, a door stood open to a slice of sky, where 3 stars had arranged themselves with the casual authority of gods at leisure. A moth battered itself against flame and then chose a different direction, its small mind preserving the only world it knew, the smell of wet hemp, of old blood, of sand that had learned to drink, braided itself into the simple air of the night and was not unpleasant. He moved through it as through a room full of ancestors. They paused at a gate no one touched. Somewhere far above, laughter thinned to a thread and snapped. From the city drifted a scale of notes from a flute practicing a hymn it had not been hired to play. He marked the distance between sounds as a farmer marks furrows, measuring for a crop he could not plant. The younger guard shifted weight, and the iron on his belt complained. The older one scratched his cheek with a blunt nail and thought, briefly and treacherously, of his son's hands. The path bent again, and the stone became colder, the kind of cold that suggests depth rather than season. He felt the night apply itself to his skin like linen taken from a basin and wrung nearly dry. He did not resist. He did not rehearse. He carried himself forward like a lamp that believed in the road more than in light. Dawn organized its colors along the horizon and found the Senate already awake. Men who preferred the gravity of midday voices spoke in the pale tones of earliest hour, their words floating above marble like thin bread on simmering broth. They rehearsed reasons and cautions and pretended to be surprised by neither. A clerk unrolled a document that did not yet exist, and wrote a heading while waiting for instructions that would transform it into law. They named the gesture prudence, then theatre, then a lapse to be corrected by future severity. They traced the map of popularity and discovered it had shifted by a handful of streets. One argued that mercy was a coin that diminished with use. Another argued that cruelty bought silence at a price no treasury could sustain. A third said nothing and watched dust move through a sunbeam with the patience of a man studying a language he had never wanted to learn. Outside the chamber, corridors picked up the conversation and carried it like a servant with a napkin over his arm. The topic gathered ornaments as it moved. By the time it reached the market, it wore a different face and smiled with another man's teeth. Fishermen told it to their nets. Moneylenders told it to their scales. The city accepted the story and placed it on the shelf where it kept the rest, reachable and out of reach. Messages left the palace at a dignified trot, their wax seals stiff as brows. Some went to governors, who would nod and file them beneath other nods. Some went to generals who would read them at tables that still smelled of horse and pine. A few went to houses where candles burned at noon, and where men calculated how a kneeling body could tilt a nation. Every letter carried the same sentence in different clothing. Stability, it said, was a picture that needed constant repainting. The hand holding the brush must not shake. Morning arrived like a priest entering a room where grief had slept and refused to leave. Light laid its deliberate hands along the city S-ribs and found what it expected and what it did not. Wash basins filled. Pigeons argued as if repeating a point that would not be believed. On a balcony high enough to mistake the streets for veins and alleys for capillaries, Commodus watched the day set its table and wondered what it planned to serve. Across the city, behind stone that remembered every season, Maximus sat with his back to the same wall as before and felt the new light arrive through the mortar. It touched the air in the room rather than the floor, and that small difference declared itself like an omen that chose to speak softly. He did not chase it. He allowed it to name itself and pass on. Endurance was a form of movement, slow enough to be mistaken for stillness, exact enough to be weapon. The amphitheatre began its daily labor. Workers raked patterns into sand and erased the past with motions practiced to the point of prayer. The marks left by yesterday's feet disappeared in a tide of even lines. The silence took a different tone, the preparatory hum of a throat before the first note. Children pointed at banners drying on a rope and guessed at colors while the cloth was still pale. A lamb's tether was coiled and hung on a peg. The peg understood something it could not say. By noon, Rome would resume the language it spoke most fluently, a grammar of spectacle and coin. By dusk, it would have told itself 5 versions of the same tale and believed 3. By night, it would listen for the hinge, the cough, the low drum that meant the city still possessed a heart. Between those certainties walked 2 figures engrossed in their separate silences. One on a balcony that mistook height for safety, one in a cell that turned narrowness into discipline. The day lifted itself to full height and steadied. In that balance there lived a promise Rome had not meant to make and could not help keeping. No blade needed to be drawn to write it. No trumpet needed to argue its case. It moved through stone and skin the way breath finds lungs without being taught. The city wore it without noticing, like a mark pressed into wax by a seal that warmed its own image. Somewhere, a bell rang as if to answer a question asked by no one in particular. Somewhere else, the answer reached the question and nodded. The noise of the day receded in slow waves, until only the soft rhythm of evening remained. Torches dimmed, their flames leaning in gentle arcs, casting the streets in amber haze. Shadows lengthened and dissolved, each one fading into the cool embrace of the night. High above, the moon unrolled her silver path across the rooftops, painting the city in pale light that softened every edge. The city's breath slowed. Market stalls stood closed like folded hands, and alleyways lay still, holding the warmth of the day only in memory. In the quiet, a leaf turned lazily on its stem, a door closed without urgency, and somewhere a child stirred in sleep, finding again the comfort of familiar arms. Rome held all of it gently, as if cradling its own dreams. Beneath the marble and stone, even the deepest corridors surrendered their weight to stillness. Thoughts loosened, slipping free from the sharpness of the day. The air cooled, wrapping itself like a calm tide around every resting soul. The amphitheater rested too, its sand undisturbed, the echoes of the crowd now no more than whispers folded into the dark. And so the night held Rome, as it held Maximus, in quiet safety. No battles to fight, no victories to claim, no defeats to endure. Only the slow drift into the dark, where the mind could let go and the body could be weightless. The moon traced her silver arc without hurry, and time itself seemed to pause, content to let the city and its people sleep. Until the first light of dawn, all would be still, all would be calm, and the world would be at peace.